Massimo Pigliucci, it is very good to see you again.
Hey, nice seeing you. It's a
Well,
different background. Do you notice?
yeah, and I'm going to ask you about that in a second. This, of course, is the Sophia program, and I welcome our viewers. Massimo is currently in Rome.
That's right.
Massimo, I thought before we started, maybe you should say just a few minutes about what you're doing in Rome, why you're in Rome, uh, and uh, and what's
And
been
then we'll
happening.
get down and dirty.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So I'm in the middle of my sabbatical at this point, and I figured that 4 months of that I will spend in Rome. The sabbatical, the main project of the sabbatical is to write this book aimed at a sort of a general audience on ancient and modern Stoicism. And the book is particularly, and we talked about Stoicism a couple of times before. The conceit of the book basically is that it's an ongoing indirect conversation between me and Epictetus, one of the major Greek Roman Stoics. And so I figured, well, I can write anywhere in the world. I'm writing about Roman Stoicism. I might as well be in Rome, which has, of course, the added advantage of seeing my family, which is nice on a more regular basis. And it's nice because I actually was able to get an apartment literally 3 minutes from the Colosseum. So when
Oh
I
my God.
run out of inspiration, I just go down and have a walk in front of the Roman Forum, and then everything comes back together.
What's the time schedule for the book? When are you supposed to be done? When is it supposed to come out? I mean, obviously that may all change, but what's the
Sure.
planned schedule?
Since it's not an academic book, it's going to be published in the United States by Basic Books, which is a publisher in New York. It's actually a fairly tight schedule. I'm supposed to be done with the first draft by the end of June, which is when I'm going to leave Rome.
Oh boy.
And then the final draft is supposed to be delivered to the publisher at the end of August. I think they're already scheduling publication. Even though I've written only about a third of the book. But they're already scheduling publication for March or April of next year.
Okay, so now
Amazing. It's just they're actually working on the cover right now. It's
wow. That's
Yeah.
not like academic publishing at all.
Not at all.
Because there's actual money at stake, right? I mean,
That's right.
So you have to say one thing about this remarkable wall behind you, and then we'll get
Yeah.
started.
Yeah, so we're broadcasting from my brother's home, and he's a collector of all sorts of stuff that is connected with comic books and superheroes and things like that. And so he has a wall, which is behind me, with all sorts of pictures of Marvel, DC, and other characters. And it's a very colorful wall, and probably our viewers can sort of eventually zoom in and see if they can recognize some of the characters behind me.
That's awesome. I have to say also, Massimo, that you're letting your hair grow out a little bit, and I have to say it looks really good.
Ah,
You don't like it?
we'll see. I'll check with my partner.
All right. So today, our subject today has grown out of an on and off argument you and I have been having across various boards on the in the interwebs, and about ethical eating. And I originally had been sort of harping on ethical veganism, but you wanted to expand the target to encompass ethical eating more generally, which is more than fine for me. So we're going to talk about ethical eating, and we're also going to talk, it's going to lead us naturally to talk a little more broadly about the role that morals should play in our lives relative to other considerations. Why don't we, since you're the one who, since you have been doing this, why don't you talk a little bit about how you understand ethical eating and what sort of led you to start ethically eating, so to speak?
Yeah. So first of all, I should say what I mean by that. So
Yes.
ethical eating is a spectrum of positions, right? So at one extreme, I suppose there is veganism, or even more radically than that, probably those people that only eat, sort of roots and things like that. So in other words, things that are actually even damage a plant. So things, fruits that come out of the plant on their own. That's fairly extreme. I don't know many people that do that. The most common sort of extreme on one side of the distribution type of ethical eating is veganism, of course, which means that you eat products that have nothing to do with animals at all, either directly, like meat or fish, or indirectly, like eggs or cheese or things like that, right?
Right.
Then a little more mainstream is vegetarianism, of course, where you do eat things like cheese and eggs, especially if they're well sourced. In other words, you tend to eat things that are, eggs that are from free-ranging chickens, that sort of stuff. Then there is a number of other positions. You can be a little less sort of out there in a sense and be a pescatarian. So let's say you refuse to eat meat because of the way in which animals are usually treated, but you're okay with eating fish as long as it is, let's say, wild caught, as long as it is not a species that is risking extinction and things like that. Or you can do what I do at this point, a situation that I'm sort of settled after having explored actually a number of these. I've actually behaved as a vegetarian and as a pescatarian, never as a vegan. I just couldn't get all that far. But the situation that I have now, that I settled on now, is what I call sort of a generic ethical omnivory or ethically informed omnivory, meaning that in theory I eat anything, or close to it, let's say. I don't eat human beings. But other than
you have to tell us that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So,
they do strange things in Italy, right? We need to.
So I eat pretty much anything, but I try to pay as much attention to where what I eat comes from and what sort of impact it has had from an ethical perspective. And that doesn't mean just the obvious. Like, if I eat meat very rarely. But if I do, I'd rather be either animals that have been wild caught, for instance, or animals that have been really, really well treated and sort of killed humanely and that sort of stuff. But it's in fact very rare that I eat meat. But it's not just that. It's also an environmental impact, right? So as I said before, if I eat fish, I pay attention to, well, is this a species that is going extinct? If so, I'd rather not. Like whales, for instance. When I was in Iceland, I did not eat whales, even though it's common fare over there. And I also tried as much as possible, because as you know, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this in a little bit, it's really complicated. Once you start paying attention to these things, the number of sources that you need to pay attention to and the number of variables it's very high. And also, it's not always quite clear who is right about what. There are very complex. It's not quite as simple as saying, "Oh, I'm a vegetarian, therefore there is no problem," because
right.
A vegetarian diet also incurs environmental impacts and so on and so forth. So, but I try to pay attention to also the sort of the human side of things.
Right.
So, for instance, is the food that I eat, come from sources where the labor itself, human labor, is well treated? Or, the obvious example is you go to a coffee house that does, not only organic coffee, but actually it's fair trade, things like that. If I can. I mean, I don't go all the way and sort of, unless it meets, unless what I eat or drink meets all of these criteria, I'm not going to do it, because otherwise my life will be really complicated and, very, very difficult. But other things consider, if I have a choice and I can make that choice, and even if it costs me a little more, or if it takes a little longer of a walk to get to the coffee place that meets my criteria better, then I do it.
Okay, so before we move on to the why, let me just focus a little more on the what. So something you said a little earlier on was that you played with pescatarianism, and did you say you also played with vegetarianism a little bit?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So
and the way you described why you didn't stick with that was sort of a I just couldn't go that far.
Right.
But does that mean that you wish you could? In other words, do you think that the vegan does represent a sort of ideal? It's just not one that you can. It's just not the one you can reach. The reason I ask this is because one of the arguments that we had started off with you saying that you admire vegans,
right?
And I said I didn't,
right?
And then we started having a whole argument about that. And I know you're not a vegan, and so I'd like to know, in a sense, how you think about the more extreme versions that you don't yourself practice.
I have an analogy, and if you don't mind, I'll go back to Stoicism as an analogy.
Sure.
And the reason for that is because if you remember when we talked about Stoicism, at some point we said that Epictetus, who is the guy that I'm writing a book about, right, who was a Stoic, actually has a chapter in his discourses where he says, ideally you would want to be a cynic, but if you can't be a cynic, at least be a Stoic. And of course, the cynics like Diogenes were those people that really were extreme in their philosophizing. They had no property. They went around essentially begging. They had a very, very simple life. And Epictetus and a number of other Stoics, but Epictetus in particular, thought that was the highest possible degree of commitment, basically, you could have.
Right.
But then he realized, not many people can do that, so at least be a Stoic. Now, my situation with veganism is different. I don't think that veganism is the peak of ethical commitment. But I do think that it does make it easier if you do want to be sort of an ethical eater, then cutting off as much stuff as possible makes it easier in terms of achieving your goal, right? Because you don't have to think about anymore about where's the meat coming from, or where's the eggs, and where's the cheese coming from? What's all of that stuff is gone. You simplify your life remarkably from that perspective. However, it also costs you, I think, or it costs most people a lot more in terms of effort and in terms of, sort of focus and sticking with it and that sort of stuff, because it's actually, the options in terms of what to actually eat are significantly reduced compared to what most people have. When you go to a dinner party, it's really going to be difficult. When you go to a restaurant, it's going to be difficult, and so on, especially if you don't live in places like New York,
right.
Where, there's a lot of people that actually gather to that. So I don't think they have necessarily the highest moral ground, meaning that you can be, I think, even an ethical omnivore and be consistent in what you do and reduce environmental impact and make sure that that you make the right choices and be perfectly fine. In fact, it's more than fine. You're perfectly defensible from an ethical perspective. But it is also much more complicated. And so if you're an ethical omnivore, you're much more likely to make missteps just simply out of misinformation or lack of proper information or something, because your culinary universe, your dietary universe is much more complicated than that of a vegan.
So the ethical vegan, you think the only real advantage, the only way in which the ethical vegan is more morally advanced than the ethical omnivore is from a sort of prudential perspective. That is, that the ethical vegan is less likely to make mistakes because they've categorically closed off an entire area of, or do you think that there is something morally more admirable in the person who goes as far as the ethical vegan?
Yeah, no, I don't. I think it's the first scenario that you brought up. But then again, that's just my opinion. If you talk to most vegans, they would disagree.
No, I realize that. And I want to be careful to distinguish whether you and I have a disagreement about what you've chosen versus where you and I might have a disagreement about what other people have chosen, towards which you might have a more favorable attitude than I have, right?
Correct. Exactly. That's right. And those are important distinctions. So for instance, I think that most vegans, at least certainly the ones that I know and the ones that I read about, most vegans would say that it is simply ethically unacceptable to eat animals, to kill an animal for food, period.
Right.
In that sense, obviously, if you agree with that position, then veganism is in fact the peak of, from a moral perspective, from an ethical perspective. Since I actually don't happen to think that, I don't think there are very good arguments for that.
Okay.
I think that if an animal, especially because we're talking about animals that actually don't live normally in the wild anyway.
They're domesticated.
Domesticating animals that wouldn't even exist if it were not for human intervention and management. I think that given that, I really don't see much of an ethical problem in sort of eating meat, as long as I said before, so the animal is well treated, it has a decent life, it's been killed in a certain way, and so on and so forth. But that again is, I think, that's a substantial disagreement with most vegans in terms of that I have with most vegans in terms of what is ethical or not. That said, I do think that from a prudential perspective, vegans have, on the one hand, let's say a clearer moral choice. It's in a sense, it's easier to be ethical if you're a vegan, but on the other hand, they also have a much more complicated life in terms of sort of practical perspective.
Okay, so let's now get to the why, and this strikes me as really important because, one of the things I'm wondering, and that'll come up later, is whether you're in a kind of a position that's very difficult to sustain. In other words, depending on what your reasons are for why you've chose to ethically eat in the way that you have, I might ask whether you really ought to be an ethical vegan, right? In other words, depending on what the reasons are. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what your reasons are for not just ethical eating in general, but the form of ethical eating that you've settled upon.
Well, my reasons are so I found myself in an interesting situation, especially as a philosopher. So for a long time, a number of years, I read arguments against eating meat by either vegetarians or vegans, including people like Peter Singer, if we want to sort of go for the big names straight away, right? And I always found them intellectually compelling. I said, yeah, sure. If I can avoid to cause suffering and death in order to eat, without, starving myself or without making life for myself so difficult that it's really my own quality of life is going to go down significantly, then why, it's hard for me to come up. It was always hard for me to come up with a good argument against it. And yet I kept being a regular
eater. Yeah.
Omnivore, right?
Yeah.
And so that sort of, over the years, that created, we're not talking many years, but over the years, that created sort of an increasing cognitive dissonance about this sort of stuff. So one day, I made an experiment with myself, and I said, okay, I think what's going on here is that intellectually, I think I understand the argument, but I cannot relate to it. At an emotional, at a deeper perspective, I just can't bring myself to make the decision, take the step. So I got one of these documentaries about treatments of animals, and I forced myself to watch it.
I think you told me this. Yeah, you forced yourself. You subjected yourself to propaganda.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I picked one that I knew. I mean, I read reviews, of course, and I picked one that wasn't really meaning I picked one of the best ones. I picked one of the ones that actually were depicting, because again, as I was saying earlier, maybe we should go back there at some point. You got to be careful because the sources of information, if you just start Googling,
it's a mess.
Yeah. Or whatever, it's a mess out there. There are very good arguments actually on both sides because it is very complicated. For instance, let me open a parenthesis. An article that made me pause a few months ago was one by a biologist. And as you know, part of my background is in biology. They say, well, it's all well and good to be vegetarian, but you do realize that means that we're now deforesting a bunch of areas of the planet. We're incidentally killing a lot of wildlife as a result. So are you sure that on balance you're really helping out even from this straight perspective of environmental and animal welfare? It's not quite that clear. You can start making calculations. The calculations are difficult to do in terms of how many wild animals lose their habitat, for instance, as opposed to how many cows, let's say, you kill as an omnivore. So it's really not that easy. But what I did was I did my research. I watched one of the best documentaries, and of course, as I fully expected, it was really horrifying. It's not pretty. It's not a pretty sight. And
you don't want to see how they make sausage, basically. That's
right. Exactly. As they say, you don't want to know how they make it. You really don't. And that actually, sort of did the trick. That's what really that I internalized. I put in balance basically at the same level my emotional response and my intellectual sort of cognitive response. And ever since, this was 3 or 4 years ago, ever since I've been actually sticking with, I've been tweaking around things, as I said, going more or less vegetarian or more or less sort of pescatarian or whatever. But I think I reached a good balance that it seems to me at this point is sustainable. In the sense that, A, it doesn't seem to dramatically affect my quality of life. There's plenty of stuff that I can eat that is very nice and so I can cook a lot. I like cooking, and so I can deal with it very easily from a practical perspective. But also, it seems to me that I can manage the information flow and adjust things without becoming obsessed about it. I mean, one of the things that that you occasionally find, at least this was one of the things you were reacting to during our discussion online, which I've experienced myself, is that sometimes you do find vegetarians, and especially vegans, who tend to be sort of literally preachy about it and somewhat intolerant about other people's habits. I have not found. I know a lot of vegetarians who are not like that, but I've occasionally encountered that, and that is in fact a turnoff. Like anybody who preaches to you in a moralizing perspective, I think it's not a good thing for in general. So, but I've encountered that only rarely, and so I've been able to deal with my decision without too much cost. I mean, it's probably costing me a little bit more in terms of money, and a little bit more in terms of time, but nothing that I cannot handle.
Right. But it sounds to me like, so the reasons you gave sound to me like they're broadly speaking utilitarian. I mean, they're broadly speaking. I'm not saying that you are a utilitarian. I'm saying the reasons you gave.
No, otherwise we're done.
The considerations that you've given are essentially utilitarian ones. In other words, you're not coming at this from the perspective of someone like a Tom Reagan, who comes at the question from a Kantian, a quasi-Kantian perspective, that in a sense you're violating the autonomy and the rights and the dignity of the animal. It's more you're concerned with welfare, matters of welfare, broadly speaking, both suffering and death. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. With one caveat that I'll get to in a moment. I think it's a good observation, however. Perhaps some of those vegans and vegetarians that I mentioned before, maybe they are actually coming at it from a more deontological perspective, whether they realize it or not. They may or may not think in terms in explicit philosophical terms. But maybe that's what they're. I mean, because if somebody says, no matter what, killing or suffering or making animals suffer for eating is wrong, period. It's non-negotiable. It seems to me like that is a deontological position. I mean, what do you mean, no matter what? Really, you cannot imagine any situation under which that would be acceptable. I can easily imagine situations under which that could be acceptable, right? Now, going back to the utilitarian perspective. So, as you know, as a sort of general philosophy of life, I consider myself a virtue ethicist.
Right.
One of the misconceptions about virtue ethics in general, I'm not accusing you of this, but I've noticed that this is definitely the case, is that people somehow think that virtue ethics has nothing to do with either duties or consequences, right?
Yeah,
because people typically associate sort of duties with ontology and consequences with utilitarianism, and so as soon as a virtue ethicist, you start saying things like, well, I think I have a duty toward reducing suffering, or I think in terms of practical matters, I rather do this rather than that, immediately say, aha, you're not a virtue ethicist, you're really a deontologist, or you're really a utilitarian. I mean, that's a misconception. I mean, virtue ethics is not about specific right and wrong, decisions about right and wrong, and it's not about specific tools, it's about character, right? It's about building your character in a broadly construed ethical way, and therefore from there, the idea is that good decisions or the best decisions that are practically possible come out. So it's obvious that a virtue ethicist will sound at times like a utilitarian, or even sometimes like a deontologist.
Sure,
without necessarily being either one of them.
Right. To the extent to which the virtue ethicist is concerned with moral virtue, sometimes moral virtue is going to involve utilitarian considerations. It's going to consider considerations of harm or damage, and sometimes it's going to consider roughly Kantian considerations like violation of people's autonomy and the like. And so I don't see anything incompatible between those sorts of considerations and a virtue ethic. I would say, however, I mean, maybe I want to push this a little bit. I mean, if you think that questions of welfare, suffering, and death are serious moral considerations, right?
Yep.
Then why isn't it fair to ask you, but then aren't those very important considerations? And how could something like your convenience at a dinner party override that?
Right. Yeah, it's fair to ask. but if you do ask that question, you sort of begin to sound like Peter Singer, and not you personally, but that kind of question immediately leads to his famous thought experiment about the drowning child
and the suit. That's right. That's right.
Or,
so what's wrong with that?
Yeah. So my favorite version actually of that is the Italian leather shoes.
Okay. Well, fair enough. Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
So right. So just to remind our viewers of what we're talking about. So Singer, who is a utilitarian, of course, has brought up this interesting thought experiment. He says, look, let's say that you're walking by a little, small river, and you just bought these really expensive, very nice Italian leather shoes, and all of a sudden you see a child drowning, and the only way the child can be saved is for you to just jump straight in and ruin your leather shoes. There's no time to take them off. There's nobody else that can help. That sort of stuff. And, would you do it? And of course, most people put in that situation would say, yes, of course I would do it. What kind of a monster do you think I am that, I prefer to save my leather shoes to the drowning child? But then, of course, once, as typical with these kind of thought experiments, once that the initial argument is conceded, initial analogy is conceded, now you got yourself into a trap. Because, of course, Singer turns around and says, well, then, it turns out that every time you make a choice of a consumerist type, every time you get your iPhone, every time you buy, you go to dinner out to a restaurant or whatever, almost anything you do that it's not strict necessity, you are in fact condemning a child to death on the other side of the planet because you could have used that money to send it over for malaria vaccination or what you name it. And that's true. The problem is, of course, that the trap springs once you buy into the idea that the thought experiment actually gives you a reasonable analogy. And I don't think it does. As a virtuoticist, I reject utilitarianism. I don't think that's a reasonable analogy. And the difference, the big disanalogy there is precisely between the fact that on the one hand, you're faced with an immediate situation right there where you're the only person that can make a difference. And in that case, it really would be callous to say, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to ruin my leather shoes. In the analogous situation, sort of the broader situation, on the other hand, now you're talking about, first of all, a much more distributed problem, right? So we do have people on the other side of the planet that are starving to death or they have problems with disease and so on and so forth. But the causes of those are much more complicated, and the solutions to those are much more complicated. For instance, one of the obvious responses to Peter Singer is like, actually, as it turns out, study after study shows that just giving money to charity isn't at all the best way to help other people. In fact, in some cases, may actually harm. There's all sorts of studies that have been coming out recently, really clearly demonstrated that you go in, you give money to a charity, the charity comes in with a perfectly reasonably sound intervention, and then in fact unintended consequences spring out all over, and you turn out to actually have done much more damage than you intended. So one of the reasons not to buy the analogy is precisely that I have pretty good control over my leather shoes and the child drowning. I have next to no control over much more complex situations that involve political, social, economic issues and complex organizations, bureaucracies, and so on and so forth. So that's one reason I think the analogy doesn't work. The other one is, well, hold on a second here. Do I really have a moral duty to make myself miserable, in order to strip myself of everything that I could do without, basically? So essentially going cynical, right?
Yeah.
Cynical with the big C, not the small c. Becoming a cynic. I'm not sure that I do, because you certainly do have that duty, I think, from a utilitarian perspective. And yes. I think that Singer is perfectly coherent when he says that. And even though he himself doesn't live the life of a cynic, I mean, we're talked about that yes. also online, right? But to be frank, I met Peter a number of times, and I know what he actually does. To be frank, he actually does much more in that direction than a lot of other people who just talk about utilitarianism or talk about helping people and don't. Like he gives something like 20 or 30% of his salary out. We just had him over a few months ago at City College for a philosophy day talk. He asked for a significant honorarium, but the honorarium went straight to, went in full to a charity. So to be fair, he's trying to do his best, although he's certainly not living the life of a cynic. I mean, he has a nice apartment. Actually, it turns out that he lives only a couple of blocks from where I live, Chelsea, New York.
I guess what's sort of been chafing about him is some of the very specific obligations that he has very forcefully said people ought to do. It turns out he does the opposite, and then when confronted on it, says, "Oh well, I'm fallible." And, that's all fine and well, but not with somebody who's preaching, right? And so that's why I find him very distasteful, because in my view, what I find is that the most moral people I know are the quietest, not the loudest. And when you're loud like that, you're asking for people to actually examine what you do. The thing with his dying, with the Alzheimer's mother, really was the one that really pushed, because he was preaching active euthanasia, and he was preaching all this sort of stuff, and then it turns out he spent $500,000 or some ridiculous amount of money on his mother's Alzheimer's care, and then when confronted with it by a journalist, he said, "Well, I guess I could have used that money I guess I could have spent the money more wisely," not acknowledging that he'd been in print hectoring people, right, for doing precisely what he'd done. And so I guess that's the only thing that sort of puts people off a little bit. So let me, in picking this up, let me ask you, because this is really the area where I want to push. In one of these conversations you and I had, I said that it seems to me pretty clear that ethical values and obligations are not always overriding. And I thought in that conversation that you disagreed with that you think that ethical and moral considerations are always overriding. And I just wanted to first clarify that, because if you do think that, then we really do have a serious disagreement. If not, then we'll see where it goes.
Right. No, I don't think they're always overriding. But I do think that part of our disagreement may be about just what we mean by ethical considerations, right? So I think that what came out during our online exchange, I thought, but we can clarify this, is that I have, from a virtue ethical perspective, I have a broader definition of what counts as ethical. For instance, if I remember correctly, at some point you brought up the example of, one of the things that I do is I want to make sure that my friends and my family and people in my congregation, whatever it is, can have a good time and can have can feel like I'm contributing locally and so on and so forth. And that of course does come as with a trade-off in terms of sending stuff from the other side of the world. Well, that kind of behavior to me counts as ethical, because again, from a virtue ethical perspective, it's about your character and your behavior within the polis, right? Which means that you have, even though the Stoics and the Cynics were cosmopolitan sort of as a general idea, meaning that they saw no reason in principle why a human being is better than another human being, sort of all things considered. The fact is that from a virtue ethical perspective, I think it's easier to argue that you have, you live in a particular place with particular people that depend on you much more than the rest of the planet does. And so I don't think there's anything wrong. And I know that utilitarians, on the other hand, and deontologists very strongly disagree with this. But I don't think there's anything wrong. And in fact, that there is something callous about, from a virtue ethical perspective, to say, well, I'm going to ignore my family, my friends, people that I interact with, including, my colleagues, my students, so on and so forth. And I'm going to focus on people that I don't know on the other side of the world because they are more in need than these people. Well, more in need and less in need is a relative matter. The fact is, my daughter counts on my help. My partner counts on my help. My friends count on my help. And those are ethically binding as far as I'm concerned. So if I do something even nothing extraordinary, but just something that, use time and resources to make those people feel more comfortable and those people feel like they're part of a community and that they have support and so on and so forth. I think actually that is an ethical choice that is perfectly respectable. That said, as a Stoic, I actually do think that we also have a responsibility, an ethical responsibility toward ourselves. So this idea of sort of self-abnegation, it's not necessarily something that a virtue ethicist would go for, because virtue ethics is about your flourishing in life. Yeah. Now, your flourishing in life does depend on being a productive member of a society. It does depend on helping others. So for a Stoic, there is no difference between helping yourself and helping the people that are around you, because you're a social being and you depend on other people in that sense. But self-abnegation is not something that is a requirement of any sort from a virtue ethical perspective. So then however, all of this I think is perfectly reasonable, but it begins to feel, I think, wishy-washy, right? It's like, well, so where do you draw the line? What is it that you think it's reasonable to sort of give up, and in terms of self, renouncing to certain things in order to help other people? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't think there is an equation there. I don't think there is easy answer like a deontologist or a utilitarian would have ready at hand. It depends. It depends on just how miserable or how good you feel if you do certain things, just how much the people that you interact with depend on you, and what does that mean in practical terms. And if you have a good character, if you're a decent person, you'll navigate your way through that. And part of that navigating that your way through that will also be, from time to time, you will reflect and say, no, I'm lucky. I live in a place like New York or right now Rome. I can afford to give some of my money or some of my time or whatever it is to people that I don't know in order to help them. And I do it, right? But how much and under what circumstances and all that, I think that's a personal decision. That I'm not going to go and preach to people and say, oh, you're not doing enough. And I'm not doing that not just because, then I don't want to be caught into this kind of Singer situation where, then I preach and then somebody else says, well, what are you doing? I just don't think it's right to do so, right? So if somebody asks me, right, if somebody says, look, I need help here. I need a way to figure out. I need a way to sort of reset my moral compass. Do you think that this is a good way to go about it? Do you think that this, what are the alternatives? Then I'm perfectly happy to say, hey, here's my experience. Here's my thinking as a philosopher. Here's my reasoning based on a particular view of what ethics means, and it's fine. But I'm not going to go around telling people, oh yeah, I'm sorry, but that iPhone you just bought, you just condemned to death, 100 people on the other side of the world. That seems like callous and preachy in a way that to me, it's very distasteful.
So you don't, this is a very tricky position to articulate. I mean, it sounds to me like you're saying, on the one hand, the ethical omnivorism that you've adopted is obligatory, but then you're sort of saying, but it's not obligatory in the sense that I wouldn't ascribe that obligation to other people necessarily in the abstract, right? I mean,
No. So that's I'm glad you put it that way, because I think that actually can help clarify even my own mind, because part of the reason I enjoyed these discussions is actually it forces me to sort of clarify what I think, right? No, I would never say that my position is obligatory or it makes demands of any sort on other people. I think the only obligation...
Do you think it makes demands on you? Is it obligatory on you? Are you doing it because it's obligatory on you?
Oh, that's a good question. Can we set that aside for a second?
Yes, of course.
All right. So we'll go back to that in a second. I don't think it makes demands on other people. I think the only demand that there is, from my perspective, on people is to be decent, to be a decent human being, okay? To treat other people well and to try to do a part for the general policy of humankind. That's the only thing that I think that everybody should really try to do.
And that can be fleshed out in a lot of different ways.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's perfectly reasonable for somebody to tell me, look, I don't feel like giving up my iPhone for, charity. But on the other hand, here, I'm a decent person because I'm doing these other things. I'm interacting with these people this way, or I'm spending my time, I'm volunteering my time, or I'm doing a number of other things, an almost infinite number of things. One of the nice things about the human condition, and I think actually, again, one of the nice features, it's often taken as a criticism, brought forth as a criticism of virtue ethics, but one of the nice features of virtue ethics is precisely that it doesn't have recipes. It's precisely that it's an acknowledgement of, look, there's many, many, many ways of flourishing, many, many ways of living a eudaimonic life. And there are many, many multiple dimensions to ethical behavior, so that I can say, well, that sort of particular behavior taken in isolation may be unreasonable or unethical or debatable or whatever it is. But if I take the full person, right, and what his life or her life is, and how she behaves in general with other people under a number of circumstances, she probably comes out to be actually a better person than I am. And so just because I give up something or I do something that maybe she doesn't do, that doesn't make me a better person at all.
Okay, so now I'm starting to, much to the dismay maybe of our audience, I'm starting to think that we don't disagree at all. Because it sounds to me like what you're saying is that, look, because the obligation part of our lives can sort of be filled in a lot of different ways. Can I
interrupt you for a second? So notice that I've been, usually I drink a little bit of water, but I'm in Italy. This is beer. Anyway.
I'm drinking coffee to keep up with you. I can't.
Go ahead.
It sounds to me like you're saying that, look, there's a lot of different ways to play this sort of morally positive role in the world. Right. People are obligated to play it in some such way, but they're not all obligated to all play it in the same such way. And so you wouldn't say there's anything wrong with the person. And now I'm going to more describe myself, who really doesn't devote much moral energy to concerns about his eating, but does expend his moral energies in all sorts of other ways, making the contribution towards the things that I care about, and with the people that I think I can have an impact on. And so it sounds to me like you really don't think it's obligatory in your framework. Right? Yes. You think that some such framework is obligatory of everyone simply because we're people. I mean, that's the sort of the basic Aristotelianism that's involved in this, right? But you think it can be fleshed out in a lot of different ways, and so you don't think that any particular way is obligatory of everyone. I mean, within some reasonable, obviously not murdering, people is obligatory of everybody. But we don't have to be that person, right? Right.
There are some things that obviously are in fact obligatory, like not going around murdering people and stuff like that. But I think that if we're talking about sort of the bell curve of distribution of
common behaviors and sort of
I think that is highly multidimensional. And in fact, even though, as we've said several times now, not only am I a virtue ethicist, but I try to study and practice Stoicism. I don't think Stoicism is the answer for everybody. It works for me. Right. It resonates with me, both culturally and probably in terms of character, sort of temperamentally. But if your view is more Epicurean, and of course I mean Epicurean not in the sense of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but in the actual Epicureans, right? Or you are more Aristotelian, or if you want to go cynic, hey, go ahead, go cynic. It's fine, as long as we realize that the only demand, I think, that is reasonable to make is to realize that we are social beings that are interdependent on other such beings, and that the flourishing life for us means a flourishing life for our society.
Yeah.
And so that you have an obligation to do something. Yeah. Right? For improving your society. I think really, if you really want to reduce it to the minimum common denominator, is as long as you're doing something, whatever it is,
be a socially positive force. Yeah.
You're socially positive. You're pro-social in some way. Yeah. Then I think I don't have anything else to add. You want to do it this way, fine. If you want to do it that other way, good. Yeah.
Okay, so then that this is really actually lovely in terms of the cleanness of the way this is sort of emerging. The last sort of thing I want to ask sort of will pull us out to a broader perspective, and that is the ethical life is only one part of the larger eudaimonic life, right? In other words, Aristotle famously just characterizes eudaimonia both in terms of multiple, let's call them valences, right? I mean, there is the dimension of civic and moral virtue. There is the dimension of theoria or contemplation, which is not a moral life, but an intellectual one. And then there are the various flourishings with respect to what we call craft or techne. And these are all painted as part of a broader picture of eudaimonism, that is, of what it is to flourish as a human being. Right. And I guess that maybe the last place where there might be some disagreement between us, although my hopes are shrinking. It seems like we only fight online. We never fight when we actually see each other, which tells you something about online interaction. Right?
Yes, I think it does. Actually. Go ahead.
And that is the relative within the broader eudaimonist palette. Does the moral, ethical, civic, virtuous dimension have dominance over the others? What I want to say is that they all are jockeying with one another, and that there is no principled way to advance one over the other, that in a sense all of them are required to fully flourish, and that which ones dominate not only vary from person to person, but may vary within a person's life from time to time. And so I'm wondering if you might answer that broader question, because to me, for example, the aesthetic dimension is very important. And so one of the reasons I simply won't go for this sort of ethical omnivorism is there's simply too much cuisine that not only that I love, but that I think is really valuable. I mean, I do think of this as not only expressions of culture, but expressions of artistic values. Right. And so how do you see within the broader eudaimonist template the relative place of the moral life to all the other ways in which we flourish?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And first of all, it may vary depending on which eudaimonist philosophy you adopt, right? So I think that Aristotelianism tends to be the most flexible.
The most multifaceted in terms of the pieces that are in the eudaimonist.
It is definitely the most multifaceted and the most flexible in terms of balance between the two the pieces. The Cynics are at the opposite extreme, if you will, right? They go for basically, as I said, for no property, nothing. It's like
what do you think?
And well, I'm in between because as a practicing Stoic, I'm literally in between the Aristotelians and the Cynics. I mean, that's how Stoicism actually placed itself, right? So for a Stoic, virtue, specifically in terms of the four fundamental virtues, practical wisdom, courage, justice, and self-control, or more general temperance. Those are actually overriding. Those are the ones that you always want to keep in mind no matter what. Could
you list them again?
So it's practical wisdom, which of course we can have a whole discussion about what that means exactly. Mm-hmm. But I think I generally understanding as the ability to navigate complex situations in the real world in the best possible way.
The morally best way. The morally best way.
The morally best way.
Okay.
That's right.
Go on.
So practical wisdom, courage, which doesn't mean necessarily or only physical courage. In fact, it's a courage of speaking up when you need to, or standing your ground when you need to, and that sort of stuff, or simply making decisions that are not easy. Period. The third one is self-control, or meaning trying not to go to excess in anything. And the fourth one is justice, and by justice, the Stoics didn't mean what we mean today, like social justice, that kind of thing. I mean, it's compatible with an idea of social justice, but it's really justice as in you treat other people justly. Remember, it's always about interactions with people, direct interaction with people. This is not a general theory of social justice, just a question of, you want to treat people as you would like to be treated, essentially, fairly, and so on and so forth. Now, for a Stoic, those four are, in fact...
They are overriding.
Right. They are overriding. And everything else, like, let's say, my doing philosophy, or my doing these conversations with you, or my drinking a nice beer, or going tonight for a really nice pizza, and so on and so forth, those are all preferred indifference, meaning that if I can do them, I do them, as long as they don't trade off with my virtues.
But how could they not trade off, given that if those other things are really overriding, they could be served by the money and time and effort that you spend on your wine and your pizza and everything else.
Right. I think that the key word there is overriding, and this may have created some of the problem actually during our online discussion. I don't think the Stoics and even some other virtuosos see the question quite in terms of overriding as in terms of compromising.
So they don't mean overriding the way a Singerite would.
Exactly.
So could you explain that?
Yeah, I'm going to try. And one of the best way actually I discovered of explaining this came from one of the readers of one of my blogs, the howtobeastoic.org blog. One of the readers, and unfortunately I don't remember his name, also because he uses one of these handles, so I don't actually know his name. But maybe we can. I'm sure we can find the link to the specific comment that I'm about to make, so that we can do it. We can post it. So what he said, he was trying himself to sort of get a hold of this idea of the virtues are fundamental, but at the same time you got these preferred indifference. What does that mean? Turns out he's an economist, or somebody who actually studies economic theories. And he says, wait a minute, economists have something like that. And they call it, there's a term for it that has to do with ranking preferences in a way that are incommensurable. Okay. So they say, so you have a group of preferences, and then you have a B group of preferences, and then you have, let's say, a C group of preferences. Within each group, you can trade off. But across groups, you don't. So let's say, for instance, let me give an example that has got nothing to do with eudaimonia or Stoicism. Let's say that my A preference is to be alive and healthy, okay? My B preference, part of my B preference is eating a pizza, okay? Now, having an A preference means that you can eat a pizza as long as it doesn't put in jeopardy your health in the long term or your life, right? So I prefer a pizza over, let's say, I don't know, a steak or something like that. So within the B group, I have preferences, and those preferences can be traded off. But those preferences cannot be traded off against group A. Similarly, in the case of and there's a term that I'll find out, and we'll post for. There's a specific term about this. By the way, the reason this analogy struck me as powerful is because this is actually one of the consequences in economic theory of the fact that people have these kind of unrankable preferences, is that you cannot come up with a single maximization function, right? You cannot say, which is a staple of classical economics, that you maximize whatever function you define in terms of consumer preferences. If it turns out, and it does turn out according to behavioral economics, that people have preferences that are unrankable, that are not compatible with each other, they're just two different games, basically. You cannot compare them. Then there is no single maximization function that you can possibly deploy from an economic perspective. So in terms of going back to what we're talking about, the thing is this. It's not that everything I do has to deploy courage and wisdom and self-control and justice. Right. Is that everything that I do doesn't have to contradict those things. So if in order to buy my iPhone, to go back to the old example, right? If that is actually an example of losing self-control, because in fact I'm spending much more than I should in terms of my own financial, condition. Let's say I couldn't really afford. Let me give a better example. Apple Watch, right? I have an Apple Watch here. It's the basic model, however, because it's a fairly expensive gadget, but this is something that I can easily afford with my salary as university professor. Had I decided, however, to buy, let's say, the top of the line model, the gold Apple Watch, right? I could afford it. I have that kind of money. But now that decision will really trade off in a gigantic way You know, it would have a major impact. So it would qualify as a loss of self-control.
Okay, so it sounds to me though like the only way that this doesn't turn into a sort of a Singerite position, that is where I say to you, look, you know, you are allowing a B concern to override an A concern because the $600 you spent on that iPhone, that Apple Watch, could have been spent on justice, could have been spent on helping a poor person or saving someone. Or the only way I see this not sliding into a kind of Singerism or forcing you into a kind of Singerism is
like the term Singerism,
right? It is precisely the much looser conception of duty that you have. In other words, the moral. You're saying that. In other words, your view is that our moral obligation is to do some good, but it's not to always do good all the time. In other words, the only way that this works is if you take the whole package. You also have to accept. You know, you have to have a much more eudaimonious conception of obligation. You can't have, because otherwise it does. I mean, the singer is right? I mean that.
For sure.
Yeah.
With that, I think you're completely correct with two caveats, which I think are important. The first one is, remember, unfortunately, what happens in a lot of these discussions is that we use terms that have been historically interpreted and are interpreted by people differently, right? So when I say, to go back to the beginning of our discussion, when we're talking about ethics, you know, it's one thing if by ethics you mean the study of right and wrong, and it's a completely different thing if by ethics you mean the study of how to live a good life. Those are very different. You know, you can use the same term, and people use the same term, but they're not the same thing at all. The same goes in this particular case with justice. Remember my note before that justice from a virtuatical, not just a Stoic perspective, but a virtuatical perspective in general, doesn't have much to do with what we today consider this God's eye view of justice, right? When we think of justice today, we mean society-wide, God's eye view, social justice kind of thing. That's not what eudaimonic philosophies mean by it. They simply mean the way you relate to people you actually relate to. Right? You treat them in a certain way. So no, I don't think that buying my watch basic model actually infringes on justice in that sense. It definitely does infringe on justice in the
Singerite sense.
In the Singerite sense.
Yeah.
But there, and here comes the second caveat. There, I think the move really is simply to turn things around on the Singerites. And that is, we started this discussion by mentioning his thought experiment, right? One of the things that I've become more and more skeptical of once I started getting interested in virtuetics is this idea of thought experiments.
Especially in ethics,
especially because these are completely ideal situations under which, of course, you have complete control. They're very simplistic, first of all, and then you have complete control of what's going on. And you say, well, sure, if you put it that way, fine. But the fact is, why would you put it that way? Because the real world is not like that. And proof that the real world is not like that is that I don't know any utilitarian or any Singerite who comes even close to that ideal. Right? So you can simply turn around the table on them and say, you're a bunch of hypocrites. You're telling me that we all should be doing this, but you're not even close to that, to that level. And frankly, as you were saying earlier, the fact that you say, well, but I'm just a human being, it's a poor excuse. I can use, on the other hand, from a virtuetical perspective, I can use the move. I can make the move of I am a human being, and being a human being. That doesn't sound very very nicely, but anyway,
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Right. So being a human basically means that I do have to balance for my own sake, right, behaviors and activities that are good for my own personal flourishing with behaviors and activities that are good for the flourishing of the polis. Right? That's what it means to take seriously human nature and to say, look, otherwise you're just going to either be an hypocrite or you live a miserable life,
or you're going to be what Susan Wolf calls a moral saint. I think that essay is very strong in explaining why moral saints are not actually something that anybody really likes or wants. So it's not. I mean, it sounds to me like the main difference between you and I is that we're both eudaimonists, but your eudaimonism is more of the Stoical and mine is more of the Aristotelian variety, such that you do privilege the moral sphere, but not in the way that a Singerite does. In other words, it's overriding, but in a very qualified sense, and one that doesn't entail these sorts of very extreme forms of life. That all of this or none of that, or the last just challenge I would put.
Oh, by the way,
yeah, go ahead.
The term lexicographical preferences.
Lexicographical preferences.
The reason economists call them lexicographical.
That's so weird. Why lexicographical?
Because remember I said A group, B group, C group. The origin of the term actually goes to alphabetizing things.
Yeah.
So if you put all books that you have into the A category and then the other ones into a B category and so on and so forth, you don't mix them. You know, within them you're the different categories. So it's a lexicographical ordering, meaning that there is the A list and then there is the B list and then there is the C list. And frankly, if you think about it, maybe not as strictly, but we all do this, right? We all rank things and we say, look, if I can afford it, I'm gonna go, let's say, on a vacation.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to starve my family in order to go to a vacation.
Right.
So that's because not starving your family is A-level commitment, and doing a vacation is a C-level commitment. Right. That sort of stuff.
Okay, so the last thing, the very last thing. So we probably differ in the sense that you see a sort of hierarchy within the elements of a eudaimonist picture of flourishing. And I'm more inclined to see them as jockeying for position and not having any sort of a priori ordering. Let me just offer one reason for my maybe thinking that I'm right about that and you're not. And then you can tell me what you think about it. And it seems to me like the elephant in the room are prudential values. In other words, it seems to me that as a matter of fact, if you actually examine people's behavior, matters of prudential value are overwhelmingly overriding in the sense that every single day we make 1,000 decisions that are in service of what are ultimately prudential values, whether matters of time, matters of money, matters of convenience, matters of effort, matters of all, and these can even be minute things. But when you add them all up, it seems to me that on a daily basis, they are in fact the overriding consideration. Right? And on a view that takes there to be this sort of hierarchy with ethical consideration at the top, it seems to me that either you have to sort of deny this, which I don't see how you can, or you have to evoke some kind of systemic fallibility, right? Or you have to sort of almost adopt a religious view of vision in which this is a sort of an unattainable ideal, but an ideal nonetheless. Now, why do you think that that's not a reason for thinking that there isn't a hierarchy, but rather there's just a whole mess of values that we have to figure out where they all fit together and which ones to obey on any given day?
Right. So that's a very good question. I have two answers. One is the standard Stoic answer, which is not going to be mine, as it turns out.
Okay.
But the standard Stoic answer is, well, actually, as it turns out, the Stoics did think there was an ideal. They call it the sage, right? So sagehood. They thought it was attainable, but that there are very few people that actually get to the level. Socrates is the classic example. And that the reason the reason those sages, even though very few people get to that point, play a crucial role is because it's good to have role models. It's good to say, look, yeah, I'm a fallible human being, but I have a model. I have something that I'm striving for, right? As long as, and that's a crucial difference, as long as the ideal, however you define it, is at least in principle possible. That's a major difference, for instance, between the Stoics
and Christianity.
Christianity, right? Because there the ideal is a god. And
it's impossible, right? Yeah.
Possible, right? So definition. So that would be one way to answer. But my way to answer, even still within the Stoic perspective, is different. Let me give you an example. Let's focus on one of the four virtues that I mentioned earlier, justice. Simply because it's the easiest, I think, to make an example, to use that one as an example. So you were saying, there's all sorts of decisions that we make, practical decisions that have, that seem to either globally, so cumulatively, or individually sometimes even override
every other consideration.
Every other consideration, right? But that's I think still, if you're thinking almost in a sort of Singerian way, that's definitely true. But if you think about it this way, so again, the virtue ethical characteristic of justice, remember, is not this overarching justice, right? It's this justice in the way in which you relate to people. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I relate to people every day, like most of us do, right? And these people include my students, my colleagues, my partner, my family, strangers in the streets, the people that I go to the grocery store, and so on and so forth. Honestly, I don't want to sound sort of pretentious, but I don't think that most of the time any of my interactions with these people compromises my virtue of justice, because I try to be mindful as much as it is possible that every time that I interact with other people, I try to treat them fairly in what a Stoic would consider to be a just way. I don't find myself having to trade off too often in that area. And when I do, it's usually my fault. So one of the things that sometimes happen is that, somebody just, makes me upset because they're saying something that I feel it's ridiculously, untenable and so on and so forth, or they're behaving rudely or something like that. And in those cases, I may lose my patience and not treat them as I would like to treat them, right? But then I think about it, and I go to my evening meditation. I say, what was so bad after all in their behavior? They were mistaken. They engaged in a bad behavior. But did you really have to get upset about it? Did you really have to, treat them badly? Couldn't you just have ignored them, or could you just have said, okay, if that's the way you feel, I think you're mistaken, and move on, right? So I don't find myself trading off too much, if at all.
Let me ask you. Okay, so I think I see where you're going with this. I mean, so is essentially what you're saying is, look, you don't deny all the prudential considerations that I'm saying people make every day. What you're denying is that those override moral values. In other words, what you're saying is, look, they only override moral values if what you mean by moral values is something Singerite, right?
Correct.
Right? Some abstract notion that I shouldn't be doing this, I should be giving my money to the poor, I shouldn't be. But they don't override. They're not overriding a moral. If anything, you might argue on a Stoic view that they're constitutive of your moral relations because of all the prudential considerations that have to go into making things work around you. And that's the sense in which it's a broader view of the ethical life. It includes the prudential considerations, and it includes... Yeah. Is that what you're essentially...
I am saying exactly that. Thank you for helping me fleshing it out. And in that sense, there really is not that much of a difference, I must say, between an Aristotelian and a Stoic.
It's more how they categorize, what they call the categories. It's not so much a difference in effect.
And it's a question of emphasis. Again, there's the emphasis goes along a continuum where the Aristotelian is on one end, the Stoic is in the middle, the Cynics is on the other end.
Yeah.
But really, yes, you're right. It's what a Singerite would call a prudential consideration and distinguishes sharply from an ethical consideration.
Right.
For a virtue ethicist, it's all one big mess.
You can't distinguish them. Yeah.
Beauty of virtue ethics is that
I agree
several times. This is the kind of thing that once you explain it to a utilitarian, let's say, or a deontologist, say, that's a major flaw of virtue ethics. Of course, there is a distinction between those, right? But to me, that's the beauty of virtue ethics.
Yeah.
It's a reflection. It's taking seriously the fact that human life is messy, complex, multidimensional, and difficult to navigate. So it's all one big bundle.
It's justice in the world, not justice abstractly conceived. And justice in the world requires that all sorts of prudential values be served, as well as other sorts of values. I agree with that. Yeah,
that's where the wisdom comes in, right? Wisdom, practical wisdom, means that you balance things in a way that, all in all, you're making a contribution to your polis. It may not be in that particular direction or that particular direction, but all in all, you're making the world a better place for yourself and for the people that are around you. And that's ultimately the only duty that I think we have if we want to talk about duty.
Yeah. Well, Sophia viewers, I'm sorry to disappoint you. Once again, Massimo and I have found the consensus in the war. Maybe we should just not talk to each other in print online.
Well, that's one lesson. But the other one is, as you know, I started having a collection of philosophical tattoos. At one point on one of our shows, I showed the
Stoic tattoo, yeah.
Right. But I have another one here that I can't show because I would have to get semi-naked to do so. It's simply a phi, the Greek letter for philosophy, right? And it has a quote that is attributed, although there's actually some doubt, to David Hume. But the quote itself, whether Hume said it or not, or wrote it or not, it doesn't matter. I think it's good. And the quote says, "Truth springs from argument amongst friends." And I think this is what is happening here.
Right. If we hadn't had the fight, we wouldn't have done a show on it, and then we wouldn't have.
And if we're not friends and sort of willing to listen to each other and say, "Oh, wait, that's what he means." Well, maybe that's not that different from what I mean. And even if it is, okay, but it's a reasonable position. I mean, that's what makes these discussions interesting and productive. Certainly for me. I don't know for you or for listeners.
Absolutely. For me. No, this is my preferred way of doing philosophy. Interlocution, where you can see the person, and that's
conversation.
Yeah. Massimo, this was wonderful. I'm really, really appreciative. I know this is not so easy for you to set up, and I know please thank your brother for allowing me to impose on him. Enjoy your dinner. Don't be too ethical about it.
All right.
You're in Rome, for God's sake. Just a little heads up, and advertise this other project of yours. Massimo is doing something pretty unprecedented. He is right now on his web blog, Plato's Footnote. He has begun process of publishing in serial form an entire book that he wrote on progress in philosophy. Yep. And Sophia viewers should be aware, and I think will like the fact that we are going to do several programs on this once enough of it's been published that I have substantial questions to ask and things like that. And so that's something to look forward to as well. And we'll probably do at least one of those while you're still in Italy, I gather. Yeah, if this arrangement is still available to you.
Yep. Yes, it is.
And enjoy Rome, Massimo.
All right. Thank you, my friend.
Take care.
Have a good one.
You too.